Ladies and gentlemen, this is not an easy panel to follow. We had really an extremely good panel and got some insights from the commercial side about Middle East, and particularly the private companies and the national oil companies that are working outside of their countries. In this session, we will be dealing with the geopolitics of the region, global geopolitics, and the geopolitics of oil. I have to first announce that I'm very sad that our friend and long-time colleague in this conference, Professor Ghassan Salamé, was unable to attend today's session because one of his friends passed away in Paris and he could not come to the conference. But we have with us today Alastair, Director and founder of the Conflict Forum, and Victor Zhikai, Director of China National Association of Energy Studies. If you look at their biodata, you'll find that both of them are eminently qualified to talk about the geopolitics of the region, and in the case of Mr. Gao in particular, how China is looking at all these changes in the developments in the region. Now, one of the areas that we have always had great difficulty with is kind of to connect the geopolitics with the oil sector. We heard a little bit about it in previous sessions, but what I was quite intrigued what Sarah said, that despite the problems in Yemen, despite the problems in Egypt, that in the countries where she was active, really it did not have much impact on production. There have been other countries that have. And it was only about 2 weeks ago when we were looking at just price movements over a relatively short period. We're looking at price movements over a period of a month, just when before Mr. Obama decided that he was going to bomb Syria, until when he decided not to bomb and actually go for a political solution. And you saw the price of oil, the price of Brent, went all the way up to 116 and came down all the way down to 103. And then we calculated that over that period of 1 month, one producer was earning $500 million a day of extra money, which is an awful lot of money. And that's pure geopolitics. That's purely related to the ups and downs based on the expectation of something could go awfully wrong. Well, we have seen geopolitics of oil has always been extremely important. But I think many of the younger generation probably cannot even remember anymore that the 73-74 Arab-Israeli war that led to an embargo because King Faisal felt betrayed by Mr. Kissinger, who said he would not support and not resupply Israel with weapons during the war. They did, and the king acted, and the king actually became the great transformer of the region in a way, and the great transformer of the oil industry, because what we, I think, talked about at the PEY dinner, the energy, the Seven Sisters went from 85% control over the world's resources and production of oil to a very small percentage today. And it started all in 73, 74. It was a major, major transition. That transition has continued. And even though Henry Kissinger succeeded in promising the GCC states after or even before the Iran Revolution, security in exchange for oil and military support, we have seen gradually over time an eroding of the Western position in the region. So, whereas since the end now of the Soviet Empire, but in particular since the Iraq War and 2011, significant changes also in the perception of the West by countries in the region. The Saudis are not too unhappy. Saudis, after all, are the major producer in the region, and they're not too happy that the U.S. failure in Iraq, and basically led to a situation where the country, the change in the both internal and external relationships of the country worked against some of the GCC countries. The failure of the West, of the United States in particular, to support the Mubaraks in Egypt towards the end. The failure in Afghanistan. The failure to strongly support the opposition in Syria, which we will hear later is of course perhaps a very wise decision of the West, but in the Gulf it was, in some of the Gulf countries it was seen as a failure. And the possible rapprochement between the United States and Iran, which is also very much feared in part of the region, all could lead to a more centrifugal movement between the superpower of the world today, still, the United States, and some members of the region. So now we are, I'm going to ask Alastair Crooke to give a kind of an overview of what's happening in the region. And then I will ask Victor to give his comments, because we have shifted from a world, the world I just mentioned of 73 and 34, 70% of Middle East oil used to go to what we call the Atlantic Basin, to Western Europe and the United States. Today, almost the reverse. 70%, if you include Japan, is going to Asia. And so that has created a whole new situation. And we will hear later this afternoon at the last session the significant growth in US domestic production, which could further change that relationship in terms of oil. But we will discuss at this panel what this relationship means. Will it really change the role of the superpower in the region, or is it already on a path that, regardless of what happened to oil, will change? So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Alastair to start the discussion.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. What I'd like to do this morning is just simply to highlight three dynamics in the region. Three dynamics, and I'm not suggesting that these are the only dynamics. Of course, there are many more. But I think that these are three key dynamics which are affecting and changing the region as we stand. But before I do, I'd just like to say, nearly 10 years ago, at that time I was working as part of Javier Solana's cabinet, his team, when he was in charge of the negotiations with Iran. At one point, nearly 10 years ago, the Iranian delegation walked into a meeting with what was then the Euro 3, the three envoys of Europe. And they did something that shocked the Euro 3. They simply challenged the basic Western doctrine about nuclear program in Iran. They said that the doctrine which believes there's no discernible difference between weapons and peaceful enrichment of uranium, the Woolstetter doctrine, the old doctrine that there can be no discernible, no meaningful, no serious distinction made between, if you like, peaceful processing of uranium and weapons program, was wrong. And that they intended to prove that you could make a distinction between the two, that it was perfectly possible to have assured uranium enrichment. And then they gave some very clear examples of how this should be done. Co-partnership, limited centrifuges, intrusive inspections, etc. The Euro 3 said, may we have a break? Can we go off and have a discussion? They went away for a few hours, and they huddled together, and they said to one another, listen, we recognize this is really important. Washington will never buy this. It's just not possible. They didn't say that having consulted Washington or consulted anybody else at that point. They came back to the talks with the Iranians, and they simply said nothing in response to the initiative. Later, they wrote up this whole process and circulated it. When it reached Tony Blair, the record of it, he immediately ordered that the documents should be very limited in circulation, that they should not circulate, and that the answer to this process was to be a very clear no. This was a tipping point. And of course, it was soon followed. Iran became the axis of evil, along with Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas, as you all know. And at the same time was set up the axis of moderates, who were intended to overwhelm and change the region in a different direction. But things changed in a slightly different course. Iran reacted to this period, to this tipping point, by mounting a defiance, by mounting, if you like, an axis of resistance, which included Syria, included Iran, included some of the movements to this process, and against the attempt to establish what might be politely called a hegemony of moderation. And this defiance, this reaction of resistance, first ignited the Gulf fears. It was the beginning of a decade-long increase of fears that were coming along from it. So now to my first dynamic. The pushback, the defiance from Iran also created some dissonance within Iran. We all recall what happened in the 2009 elections that took place in Iran. But what has happened since then is very significant. Iran, in its extraordinary labyrinthine political way, has started to come together again. The dissonance that was present in the system has somehow been absorbed. A new leadership has been elected on a huge mandate from the people and has produced a genuinely centrist leader out of this process and a new political direction. What I'm saying, in a sense, is despite all of the problems and the difficulties of 2009, the Iranian political system, complex as it is, worked and produced a new direction and a new leadership that enjoyed support not only from Rafsanjani current, from the reformists, from Hatami, but also from conservatives, a substantial number of conservatives and principalists. What is the new direction? The new direction, just to be clear, is a global opening and transparency, not just directed towards the United States, but directed much more widely, including it is directed, of course, also towards the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And it is also integrated and a play into the changing, if you like, political order. The global order, which is moving from a unipolar form of global order to something much more complex and much more varied. So this is one dynamic, a coming together in Iran that is profound, and well before the elections, we were told very clearly that this was coming. It isn't the product just of Rouhani. It isn't simply one man's reactions to elections and to trying to win the next election. It does reflect change, we believe, because we were told well in advance that this opening was afoot and was coming. Reflects something much more profound taking place in it. Then the second, if you like, dynamic of the region. On the one hand, Iran somehow coming together, somehow its economic model working and producing a political result, and in the Sunni Arab world, the reverse, fragmentation and disarray in it. The Gulf states' initial anxiety increased in 2006 after the Lebanon war and the signs of, if you like, revolutionary Islam becoming stronger, and then again, of course, with the so-called Arab awakening, or what I call the Arab upheaval. The attempt to try and build, if you like, an intifada, a Sunni intifada, using the tools of sectarianism and grievance and a large dose of money in order to contain and confront, if you like, this defiance and resistance in the region that was building up, has actually produced the counter-reaction, a counter outcome to what was intended. Far from building a unity amongst the Sunnis, it has led to divisions to extremism. We have extremism has actually jumped out of Pandora's box. I make no bones about it, whether I live and have lived for the last 9 years in Lebanon, but whether you're in Lebanon or Syria, you can see that the demons are out in many parts of the world. The Savonarolas, if you like, are afoot throughout our region in this place. But it has produced even more profound differences. Sunni political Islam, which was a strong force, if you like, as we saw in the early days, stands now in complete disarray. Sunni identity, which was so closely associated with the state project. For most Sunnis, the idea of Islam has been closely associated with being of the state, established within the state, if you like, being Islam in a sense too. All of these certainties seem to have dissolved in the last years. Fundamental questions are opening out. Is Islam within the state, or is it on the side of the people against the tyrannies and depredations by the state? Questions that are very profound and will not be easily resolved. What I mean when I talk about, if you like, the tensions can perhaps best be summarized in one simple anecdote. 30 years ago, when I was involved in Afghanistan and was responsible for the links with the Afghan political and resistance leaders at that time, Saudi Arabia was leading, if you like, the thrust to promote an Islamic front to confront westernized secularism in Kabul. What we have today is quite different. Saudi Arabia, paradoxically, is now leading a campaign in favor, in support of westernized secularism in order to decapitate and undermine an Islamic movement, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This is a huge contradiction and summarizes the tensions and the sense of coming apart that we have within the Sunni world. The third dynamic, and that dynamic is the one with which I think you'll be most familiar, of course. The dog that did not bark in the night. The attack on Syria which did not happen. Of course, for the Gulf states, which have spent so much effort, with so much anxiety, but they've seen the increasing, what they fear is the rise of new ideas and threats to their heritage authority in the region. Suddenly, they watched Obama apparently do a U-turn on Syria. But what was much more profound and what has so unsettled the Gulf leaders, which has really frightened them in many ways, is, of course, whereas they may blame President Obama, they know full well in themselves it wasn't Obama, it was the system that buckled. It was not just the president, it was the people, the American people, and the American Congress. It was effectively a reaction, and this is what American polls said. It was a reaction which was not about a yes or no to attacking Syria, but it was a doubting of the whole mission of trying to recreate, if you like, the Middle East in an order. The whole idea, the idea of recreating the Middle East in the order had become a bad movie for Americans, and one which didn't seem to have a good ending in view. It is, in effect, the end of the Carter Doctrine from that period, the end of the umbrella on which the Gulf states have so much relied in this period. And this is going to have a profound effect. And we have seen already a very strong reaction from many of the Gulf leaders, huffing and puffing that they are going to take up the burden of the United States themselves, and indeed they're going to continue with the war against Syria, and more than that, that they are going to confront, as Prince Turki recently said in London, we are going to confront Iran in almost Churchillian phrase in each and every place and every action of Iran and the Shia, we will confront it directly. But this seems a little fanciful. I don't think it's likely that Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states have the abilities to do what the United States has not been able to do in this period. And also there are many ties, gossamer threads, that tie those Gulf states very closely to the West and the United States. The other aspect to this is that I think you will see, and part of what I said about the new dynamic in Iran was an outreach, not just to the United States, not just to the other states, but an outreach to Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf states. And you can see the evidence of that in the new appointment in Iran by the Supreme Leader of the new National Security Advisor, a National Security Advisor who specifically was decorated by whom? King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia for his mediation efforts some 10 years ago between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran will try and make it easy for Saudi Arabia. Will Saudi Arabia be able to make a transition to this new era, to this new global area? We have to see. There are clearly different currents within the kingdom, different points of view, and we will see what will be the outcome. But the point I want to finish with, and the points I want to really make, is whether or not, when I started my story about the relationship between the West on the nuclear program, whether or not there is a successful outcome of the negotiations, the new initiative that Rouhani is taking with the United States. And I really don't know that it's possible. I believe it is going to be really very, very difficult for many, many reasons. But really, this is irrelevant in some respects because those dynamics will continue irrespective of whether there is or is not agree. The Gulf has to understand, is beginning to see and understand, Iran is not going to be attacked and undermined. Syria is probably going to remain as very similar to what it is. And that is the reality that the Gulf states will have to see in the longer term. Well, what does this all mean for you gentlemen here? I'm not an expert in your industry at all, but it seems to me fairly clear. And what I hear in Tehran and what I understand is that they see clearly the strategic implication of the possible shift in the tipping of the balance, both for Iran, for Iraq, and Syria, right through to Lebanon. We're talking here in terms of which was put to me by a leader in Tehran. Washington thinks the pivot to Asia lies in Washington. Actually, the pivot is going to lie in Tehran. The energy pivot of Asia is going to be in Tehran, in Iraq. And we have seen very clearly, and I know the Iraqis may not say this too clearly because they know that Iran is the sort of live rail, the live wire for the West, but we've seen this in a much closer cooperation between Iran and the Iraqis on cooperating, on sharing oil and gas fields in the region, and also the planning going ahead for the pipeline through to the Mediterranean from Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So we are seeing something that will have an important, I believe, strategic impact, not only politically, but also in this new era. The Carter Doctrine is over. America will not disappear from the region, but it's going to be a different region from the one in which we have seen in this period. It may still tip into something more serious. Who knows in it? We are in a period of great instability. But we should also be aware that Saudi Arabia, if it makes this transition, is still, like the other Gulf states, will have to contend with the fires that it set originally in this nearly 10 years ago when it started to fire up radical Sunni Islam, just as I saw 30 years ago in Afghanistan, the consequences of this have been a move towards extremism within the Sunni spectrum, and that will not be easily contained and will be something the Gulf states themselves will have to deal with, even if they are come to terms with Iran on issues such as Syria and Lebanon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alastair, for an extremely interesting and challenging introduction, which I'm sure we will have a lot of questions and comments. And I think your last part fits in beautifully with Victor's this talk, because what we have seen now is that China, when I used to go to China in the 1990s, when I was still an oil exporter, trying to get China to agree not to export too much oil in order to depress the price, has now become the biggest importer of oil in the world, the #1 importer. While the US imports are declining, China's likely to continue to rise, and with it, of course, China's interest in the region, commercially and other. And so it would be very interested for us to hear your views and what your perception is on how China looks at the changes in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to come back. And before I start, please allow me to acknowledge the participation of several of my countrymen here. And if I heard the numbers correct, if we assume there are about 500 members attending this year's conference, the participation from China, including me, accounts for less than 1%. So we have a lot of work to do. And if you consider the weight of the Chinese energy sector in the global energy sector, probably in the coming few years, the Chinese participation in this very important conference will go up to at least 5% or 10%, or even on a pro rata basis, 20%. So I would say that we heard Schlumberger's officer talking about the age of our audience may change in the future, and I believe there may be more participants from China attending this very great conference. Thank you for having me again. Now, allow me to start with the name. This session talks about MENA in transition. In Chinese, we call MENA by another name. It's called WANA, West Asia and North Africa. So MENA becomes WANA in our conversation in China. And MENA, or WANA, is so important to China, especially in the energy sector, that the foreign ministry in China has a special department on WANA. And the Ministry of Commerce also has a special department on WANA, West Asia and North Africa. Now, directions actually matter the more you think about it. And we know that in the whole world, directions are all relative, except in two places where they become absolute. One is, of course, in the North Pole. The other one is, of course, in the South Pole. But everywhere else, it's all relative. Because you remember China is used to be called in the region of Far East, whereas in China, the name of China in Chinese today is actually refers to the country in the middle. So I think one challenge for MENA or WANA is how do you look at yourself? What's the direction? Whether I'm really in the middle, whether I'm in the west, whether I'm in the east, and which way to go. I've been looking at the western direction for all these years, and it is time to look more in the easterly direction. But let me say, this MENA or WANA is very, very important to China. We know by the end of this year, China probably will have consumed more than 500 million tons of crude oil. And more than 60% of that will be imported. And among the imported, about 50% comes from the Middle East. In China, we do have a word called Middle East, exactly as you say, but also we use that interchangeably with West Asia. And plus, China's import of crude oil from Africa accounts for about 1/3 of China's imported oil. That means about half of the crude oil China consumes this year comes from West Asia and Africa. And this number is going to increase significantly. I think in the coming years, the calculation is by 2020, we will need to use more than 700 million tons of crude and probably up to about 800 million tons of crude. Therefore, as far as China is concerned, as far as people like me are concerned, everyone in MENA or WANA is a friend. And if you ask what is China's attitude toward this area, I would say the big challenge is that we want to be friends with everyone, and we do not want to be enemies with anyone. And this is easier said than done, because sometimes the friends that we want to have happen to be enemies with each other. That's a big challenge. You know, whether the enemy of my friend becomes my enemy, or whether I pretend to ignore the enemy of my friend, or whether I do something to turn my friends, who happen to be enemies with each other, into friends between themselves. Oh, this is very complicated. We happen to be in London, of course, but each time when I go to MENA or WANA, I always have the highest level of humility, because I have to be extra cautious and extremely prudent and very, very circumspect in talking to any friend in that particular region, because you do not know what exactly their very complicated background or historical lineage or ethnic kind of a complication or sectorial linkage will trigger something that you actually tend to ignore. Therefore, I would say from the Chinese perspective, whenever we engage with MENA or WANA, we are humbled. We know it's a region rich in history. All the three religions originated over there, and everyone is important. No one is not important. Whenever I go to Saudi Arabia or go to Qatar or these places, everyone is dressed in robes, and I refer to everyone as a sheikh or as an emir. I cannot underestimate the importance of any of my friends. So this is the complexity. Now, allow me to come back to the energy sector. Yesterday, we heard our very distinguished friend, Christopher of Total, whom I hold in highest respect, saying that at least in the energy sector, it is not a revolution. At best, it is progress. Do you know, I spent the whole night last night thinking about this. And I want to share with you my own interpretation. I used to be interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, so sometimes I have to achieve the highest level of accuracy. I think while Christopher had a point, the fact that one of the highest regarded Frenchmen calls something not as a revolution itself is a revolution indeed. Why? Why? Because when I was invited to this year's conference here in London, and I thought about the title, A Revolution in Progress, I thought the organizers were using the typical British understatement to describe some phenomena. So I thought what the organizers meant was not one revolution in progress. The reality may be many revolutions in progress. And when we look at the energy sector, how can you say, with due respect to Christopher, of course, and anyone sharing his view, but how can you say this is not a revolution when Japan is shutting down all its nuclear power stations, when South Koreans are having jittery things, reactions about their nuclear reactors, and when Germany, as a whole nation, will phase out their nuclear power stations, and when the American energy revolution based on shale gas is real from the Chinese perspective, we say it is a real revolution. It is going there, it's going to stay. And I know there are friends in Russia who even today refuse to recognize this revolution in the energy sector triggered by the American shale gas revolution. So I would say, in this sense alone, for countries of the OPEC or OAPEC or any country in the MENA or WANA region, I would say this in itself is a revolution. It's a profound revolution. If you do not know where to look, east or west, or even worse, if you look in the wrong direction, holy God, no one will bless you. This is one thing. Now, in MENA region, it's even more complex. Let me tell you a story, and I will refresh myself with a new story. I used to be interpreters for Deng Xiaoping. In the 1980s, Iraq and Iran were at war with each other altogether. It lasted for about 8 years. And there were many American visitors to China at that time, and I was very privileged to sit in many of these meetings with Deng Xiaoping as his interpreter. And the American view at that time was that they were completely unrestrained in their hate of Iran, and they were completely unconstrained in their love of Saddam Hussein. So they supported Iraq without any reservation, and they hated Iran without any reservation. Maybe that's the privilege of being an American. And they urged China to support Iraq without any reservation, just like the Americans did. And they urged China to abandon Iran. And do you know, Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s was already very advanced in age. He was 58 years older than I was. And he, at that time, was already a man of few words, but each word served as a bullet which bites. So he basically said, despite of all the urgings from the Americans, including Vice President Bush, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, Secretary of State Schultz, and former President Nixon, former Secretary of State Kissinger, etc. He basically said one thing, and I hope you'll keep that in mind, because that will help you understand the Chinese philosophy. And I'm revealing this actually for the first time to a public audience like this, so you are privy to this. He said, we need to keep a rear hand. Very simple. A hand in the front, it's a front hand. If I put it here, like this, it's a rear hand. So Deng Xiaoping said nothing, but said, we need to keep a rear hand. Now, I have to acknowledge to you, at the time when I heard him saying that, and when I interpreted, I actually did not fully grasp the philosophical and historical implication of that, until when President Bush launched the first Iraq war, I came to appreciate the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping. And then the Americans launched the second war against Iraq, and rather than congratulating themselves on winning a big victory out of Iraq, they are now buried somewhere. This bleeding caused in America, not only financially, but also in terms of the prestige of the United States as a war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, etc., are obvious to everyone. And you may say, Victor, that's old story. Tell us something new. Then let me use the recent Egyptian situation. I would say the Egyptian situation happens in front of our eyes. Egypt, ever since the late 1950s, has been one of the most important countries, closest to China ever since the late 1950s. But ever since the so-called Arab Spring happened, China, if you refresh your memory, is the only major country which has held steady in dealing with Egypt. When Mubarak was the president, China dwelt with him with all the dignity he deserved as a president of Egypt. When the riots or revolution happened, China did not do what the other major countries do by throwing Mubarak under the bus. When there was an election, China did not participate in any interference or siding by one side against the other. When Mr. Morsi became the new Egyptian president, China did not vent anger at him or try to launch a coup against him. China actually dwelt with President Morsi of Egypt with all the respect that any Egyptian president would deserve. When the generals launched their campaign against Morsi, China dealt with the interim government with all the dignity and the respect that any government in Egypt deserves. Therefore, rather than any other country which jumped from one side to another, which had their own motivations, where they want to choose their own people or their own side to put their bets on, I think China amazingly held its own ground and was steady in dealing with the government of Egypt. Therefore, whenever you are confused with a Chinese position as far as MENA or WANA is concerned, think about this as a principle. In the 1980s, China had several choices, either to have nothing to do with either Iran or Iraq, or to do exactly as the Americans did, or urged China to do, to side completely with Iraq against Iran. And do you know what China did? China kept equal distance to both Iran and Iraq. And when both countries asked China to supply arms, do you know what Deng Xiaoping did? He supplied almost an equal amount of arms to both of them. That's called the equal distance. And in the future, I think, I'm pretty sure among this very distinguished audience, there are people from GCC countries who may sometimes have disagreement with China for Syria, for example. Or there may be very distinguished friends here from Libya who may still bear a grudge against China when they say China actually was in support of the head of state in Libya until the very, very last minute. This is actually what China does. China deals with the head of state and the government in any particular country with the due respect and the dignity that these countries deserve. Before I wrap up, I would say the future is full of change. And I will say in the energy sector, and whenever you talk about energy, it's never energy for energy itself. Energy is always related to war and peace, geopolitics, etc. If you allow me to say, I would say the British Empire was an empire based on coal, and the American Empire is an empire based on oil. And we are attending the very important Oil and Money Conference. But in my view of the world, in the future decades to come, even this will change. Why? Because gas is becoming increasingly important. It's amazing to go to Middle East and major oil-producing countries want to import natural gas. I have thought about this, and I want to share this with you before I wrap up. That is, the world is no longer going to be a world of oil. It's at least oil and gas. But the more you think about it, the future will be gas and oil. So I've even created the word gas and oil, G and O, rather than O and G. To such an extent, I want to share with you, before I fully wrap up, a poem I've written about this mega trend. And you think, Victor, you are talking about a poem for the energy sector? Energy sector tend to be boring, is that right? But allow me to read this out. Very short. Gas, gas everywhere. Quite a lot is from shale. Gas, gas everywhere. Not a single cube to waste. Gas, gas everywhere. The age of oil is to end. Gas, gas everywhere. The age of gas is at hand. Therefore, while I'm a very big fan of Oil and Money Conference, if you allow me to think ahead, I may even say the organizers of the meeting in the future years to come may even consider changing the name from Oil and Money to at least Oil and Gas and Money. Or if I'm proven to be right, you may even change that to Gas and Oil and Money. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor, for very insightful views of China and China's relationships with actually the world and with the Middle East in particular, because you follow a similar policy in Africa.
Yes.
Rather than confrontation, it is finding your way to cooperate with everybody. I have a question here for Alastair. in what direction do you see the Middle East tipping? And looking at both the internal, the regional and global dynamics, what are the implications for the Gulf states?
I wrote an article very recently, I think in the Guardian, on Monday morning, in which I called this really a point of inflection. By that I mean, I think that what we have seen when we have moved so mysteriously from the very brink of a war over Syria, and I believe it really was, we were on the brink of something much more substantive than simply an American strike into Syria. And suddenly we move into a position which has got, if you like, is pregnant with the possibility of some form of solutions coming out, not simply for Iran, but of course in the context of an Iranian rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, the possibility of a solution in Syria too. I think these points are always quite mysterious. Often these elements have been around for a long time. We saw the same thing with Gaddafi and the, if you like, ending of his nuclear weapons. It's not something that is new, but for some reason, suddenly it becomes effective, and suddenly we have an initiative moving in that direction. I don't know, as I say, we had a tipping point 10 years ago in the region, and that tipped towards conflict. I hope that this one will tip towards solutions, and I think it's quite possible it will. What will that do? I think it was what I was trying to suggest, is that we see really quite a strong realignment. What we will see, in a sense, is that the Iranian has come together. Its system, and this is seen in the region. It may not be so well seen in here, but people understand that, in a sense, the Iranian system has produced the goods. It's worked. It's produced a leadership, a new leadership, and a new direction. And they see, on the other hand, the turmoil that exists in the Arab world. A turmoil not only in terms of ideology, on thinking and institutions, I mean, a really serious disarray, and a disarray within political Islam. I would say that it goes further than that what we are seeing, in a sense, is a breakdown of much of Sunni identity. And this is going to take time for it to reform. When I say that about the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm not suggesting that they are finished and that they're over and political Islam can be wiped from the board. On the contrary, I don't believe this is the end of political Islam. I don't think it's the beginning of the end, but it's certainly the end of a chapter in political Islam. And we're going to see a huge change. But we don't know how the Muslim Brotherhood is going to react. Its first reaction is to go underground, but the subsequent reactions are not clear. We don't know how other states are going to deal with it. But I think the fundamental outlines of a tipping in this broad sense of, on the one hand, a coming together, and on the other hand, a fragmentation and implosion, make it quite clear where the strategic direction is lying.
Thank you, Alastair. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the floor. Sadat. Sadat Al-Husseini from Saudi.
Yes, Sadat Husseini, and my question is to Alastair. A famous French politician, Clemenceau, you recall, said war is too important to be left to generals. Do you suppose that that's what Mr. Obama has discovered recently? Thank you.
Yes, I think this is. I think that this was very apt. I think what you say is quite right. In fact, there was quite interestingly a debate about this in a magazine in London, which is called The Prospect magazine, and you saw exactly this reflection. One of the Conservative MPs got up and said, "This is terrible. The worst disaster to ever hit British foreign policy since records began. We can't let these decisions be taken by the people, by Parliament. It's not right. They have to be taken by the Prime Minister and the military leaders themselves. And I think that you're absolutely right. And it's not just that Obama has come to this sense. I do think that this is something more, that we sense the vote in Parliament was a real vote of public disesteem for these missions, not just the FN, and the same in the United States. A shift in public consciousness, if you like, in that direction. And Obama picked that up, I think.
I think, Faridun, you had your hand up earlier.
I have two questions. One for Alastair. I think you're absolutely right that the problems that Iran faces in terms of resolving the issues are very, very big. But there are some interesting things which can happen or in the motion at the moment which shows the sort of gas diplomacy, so to speak. Two big pipelines are being built to Iraq. 2 BCF a day of gas will be going to Iraq at very high prices. So for some reason, the Iraqis are prepared to pay very high prices to the Iranians. I think pipeline of gas to Oman is now a real possibility after waiting it for at least 10 years every year. This time is likely to happen. I expect that the Iranians will sort out their problems with the Crescent Petroleum and will end up supplying gas to UAE. These are things which can be done without worrying too much about the structure of the sanctions, particularly in Oman, where you can put the Iranian gas inside the Omani domestic market and use the domestic gas from Oman to export it. So you can actually avoid all of the problems. So there is a number of moves which can happen without full resolution. And I think these are in motion. I wanted to get your reactions on that one. And to Victor, your presentation was very eloquent. In fact, both of your presentations were really eloquent. In the Chinese side, the demand growth essentially means that the options for pipeline are now very limited, and more will be coming to the Sino-Pic system in the south where complex refineries exist. So more and more will be coming from the Middle East. But don't you think there is despite all the eloquent justification, China has been very clever and very good, but Chinese don't know how to talk to anybody who is not in the government. There is, I think, a weakness in the system that you need to be able to talk to other groups. And by following the same rule that we talk to everybody who's sitting in the office, they really give up the option of talking with other groups who might be coming to power. That has some value.
I'll like you.
Absolutely. I think you actually hit the issue right on its head. China, as it is today, is not very good at dealing with anyone if it is not the government. China tends to deal with the government in whatever country as it is, and they have a very well-established rules to deal with the government. For example, a typical Chinese diplomat is not allowed to talk to the opposition because they are worried about if I talk to the opposition party, it may be construed as an interference in the domestic affairs, and it may be construed as a slap in the face of the government, etc. And in China, we actually do not have very vibrant NGOs. The government has talked a lot about opening the door wider so that social organizations can be established, but in reality, we are way behind that. However, this problem, which is indeed a problem, can also be viewed in a more constructive way. That is, if you look at the Chinese foreign policy towards any country, it is highly predictable, it's highly stable, and if you are, for example, the government of Saudi Arabia or government of Kuwait, etc., in any of the MENA or WANA countries, you do not need to worry about Chinese being involved in overthrowing the regime or supporting the opposition or siding by the, whatever sectors there are in the society, because this is not China is going to do. So the present phenomena in China can be viewed in a negative way or in a more positive way. But anyway, I thank you for this question, and I think China need to change. China need to be more directional in engaging with any of these countries, in MENA countries in particular. I think this is what we need to do.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to follow on the lead and say I agree entirely also with the first part of your question. I just want to underline a little bit to make clear why Iran thinks in this way, because it's very closely reflected also in the understanding of Foreign Minister Lavrov, when he really believed that what has happened on Syria marks a shift in the global order, that it was for a long series of unilateral actions in the global order. They've drawn a line in the sand, and we are now moving to something that is different, perhaps a relationships between power coalitions rather than states, if you like, and that the prospect there for Iran, and why I said the opening was not just to the United States, the opening was to the Gulf states and much wider, is that this plays into the, if you like, into the new emerging global order. And it's quite important too, because in the sense of most of the sanctions that Iran is affected by are the sanctions not of the United Nations, but the sanctions of the United States, principally and to a lesser extent the European Union, which are not reflected in the UN structures. So there is, if this works, far too early to say, quite a possibility that the United States will find itself more isolated on the issue, with the transparency that Iran is offering, not necessarily just to Washington, but to Gulf states and to the world at large. And the other factor which is quite important in this, in Iran's thinking, is that Syria has, in the process of giving up its chemical weapons. Iran has very clearly, both by the supreme leader, the president, the foreign minister, disavowed completely weapons of mass destruction in Iran. I think that this will create a different atmosphere in the whole region, because if there are no weapons of mass destruction, apart from the one that we don't know about, which obviously we all know about, apart from that, it is a move in which many states and many regions, including China and Russia, will be ready to engage with in a much more positive and a much more direct way. And that will open precisely what you say, the chance of pipelines, gas, and I think it's quite right. When my colleague here talked about gas, I'm sure that that is exactly how Iran and Iraq, and again, I want to emphasize that it's wrong to see Iraq as in opposition to these changes. There is being a very close cooperation about a sharing of oil, understandings about shared fields between the two. Now, Iraqis don't talk much about this because it is the live wire, Iran, sanctions and everything. But it is a reality. And of course, when you talk about gas being the future, when you take Iran and Iraq as a unit or as a cooperative element within it, the old order, the oil of certain other states, suddenly slips down into being much less important, not only in the present, but more particularly in terms of the potential for the future, potential both in oil and gas for the future.
I think there at the back was, yes. Yeah. Huh? Oh, okay, yeah, okay, that, and then you, is that Samira, I think? Yeah, after Stephen.
Sorry, there's a queue here. Yeah, this is Mohammed Barkindo from Nigeria, to Alastair Crooke. I think we recall it was President Khatami who attempted to launch and promote the dialogue of civilizations. And immediately after him, we had two extremes. Bush Jr., the doctrine of axis of evil, and his twin brother, I may call him Ahmadinejad. Alastair, don't you think that after having seen those two extremes and the consequences, particularly on the region, there is probably no any other option open to both in going forward. President Rouhani and President Obama are totally different people from those two twin brothers. Although we haven't had much detail from the response and the Washington behind closed doors meetings on Iran and the run-up to the New York meetings, did you notice the body language of President Obama on Iran and, of course, Syria? This brings me to my question. Don't we put ourselves or taking a risk of becoming too optimistic too early, considering what has transpired both in New York and after New York? We had somebody in New York who said he wished he could trust President Rouhani. And the last speaker, one of the last speakers who asked you a question from that region, did share something with us yesterday, that as the plane of President Rouhani touched down in Tehran, there was some fiasco at the airport with people demonstrating and throwing stones, that he had become a traitor. Now, do you think that this may go the way of the dialogue of civilizations, or do you see this as serious, genuine, dynamic change that will be profound going forward? Secondly, your conclusions after your experience in Afghanistan, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt before Morsi and after Morsi, don't you think that your conclusions on the identity of Sunni Islam or political Islam is a little bit misleading? Because the profound developments that we witnessed in the last couple of years, termed the Arab Spring, the political upheavals in the region, are not developments that you can easily explain through this worn-out doctrine of either Sunni or Shia Sikhism or rivalry. It is something that is more complex, that will probably require another session, probably in the next year's Oil and Money Conference.
Alastair, could you
Thank you.
answer the question?
I will try. I tried to say at the beginning, and I go back to it, is points of inflection like we had 10 years ago and like I believe we have now. I don't know which way it'll tip. I don't know whether it'll tip towards solutions or towards further confrontation as it did in the last occasion. I agree with you. It's very difficult in that. I also agree with what you said, that of course, if America says, as it seemed to be saying, that a small, ever so small strike on Syria is not doable by the system, then Iran becomes even less doable by the system. The Carter system, the Carter doctrine is over. So the logic of that, both for the United States and for Israel, is the need to reassess their situation versus both. Whether they'll do that or not, we are in a time, where things are driven by events more than they're driven by strategies. Now, when you finally, because we're, I know, getting short on time, so I can't go into it in much detail, but I take your point about, being too prescriptive about what's happening in Sunni Islam, and I did try to say that it was not the end and not even the beginning of the end, but a new chapter was opening in Sunni Islam. I'm not, and I just go back to that and I say, in a sense, when I talk to the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, as I did last week, and said to them, well, what are you going to do now? I mean, can you go back? How can you revive the doctrine since Hassan Banna of a sort of, if you like, permeating into yourselves into power? Completely clear. And he said, listen, that's over. That's completely discredited. We have to find a new way. And so all I'm saying is at the moment there's a certain disarray within, if you like, Sunni Islam, and that's affected people's senses of identity as a consequence.
Thank you very much, Alastair. Sorry, Samira, we are running out of time. We are 5 minutes over time, actually. We have to wrap it up. I would really like to thank both speakers for the excellent presentations, the excellent interaction. Please join me in. Thank you very much.